Winter came to the Wyoming Territory in 1884, not as a blanket, but as a hammer. It shattered the quiet, drove the weakness from the land, and left behind an air so thin and sharp it cracked the skin. The road to Prospector's Rest was less a road than a scar, a frozen gash of mud and ice that followed the path of most resistance. The wind, coming down from the high peaks, had no mercy. It was a constant, high keen, a blade looking for a gap in the wool, a crack in the will. Calder Holt felt it in his hands. He gripped the reins, the leather stiff as cured iron, his knuckles white beneath the cracked, soot-stained skin. His hands were his trade. They were Smith's hands, broad and calloused, but the cold had found its way in, splitting the skin over the joints. He was a blacksmith, a widower, and a father. And on this day, all three roles felt like weights pulling him down. The wagon bed behind him was shallow-loaded, flour, salt, and bullets. The holy trinity of survival, purchased with a coin sack that felt frighteningly light against his ribs. This trip was a necessity, one he had put off until the flour barrel was near empty. His forge at Holt's Bend was miles from this place, miles from anyone. That isolation, once a comfort, was now a threat. If he couldn't get supplies, isolation became a tomb. Behind him, burrowed deep under a mound of grease-stained wool blankets and a worn buffalo hide. His children were silent. Milo, at 9 years old, was the watcher. He had his mother's dark, serious eyes and Calder's stillness. He hadn't been a child, not really. Since May had been taken by the fever 2 years back, Rosie, only 6, was a scrap of resilience, a small, warm thing huddled against her brother's side. They had learned the hard lessons of the high country's silence saved warmth, and complaining changed nothing about the wind. The wind was the true master here. The back left wheel found the patch of soft earth first. It was a betrayal of the frost, a hidden pocket of hungry gray mud beneath a skim of deceptive snow. The wagon lurched, a heavy, sickening dip. The wood of the axle groaned in protest. The heavy-headed mule, Clara, stopped dead, her ears flat. Calder didn't curse. Cursing was a waste of breath, and breath was steam in the air. A small cloud of life instantly stolen by the cold. "Whoa, girl," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. He swung down, his boots hitting the frozen ground with a solid, unforgiving chunk. The cold, held at bay by the motion of the wagon, rushed him, biting at his face. He looked at the wheel, sunk to the axle. He sighed. The sound whipped away. He walked to the side of the track, his heavy canvas coat restricting his movements. He kicked at the base of a cluster of small, wind-blasted pines, their needles brittle. He broke off branch after branch, the sharp snap of the wood loud in the silence. He jammed them into the muck, layering them, forcing them under the wheel, creating a bed for the tire to find purchase. His gloves were useless against the seeping wet. He moved to the mule's head. She was old, patient, her coat thick with frost. "Easy, Clara," he whispered, rubbing the frozen, bristly hair between her ears. "Just one more pull. Get us to the rest. There's oats at the stable. Girl, I promise you that." He took the harness, putting his shoulder near hers, bracing his feet, ready to add his own strength to hers. "Now, hup!" He pushed. The mule strained, muscles bunching under her hide. The wheel screamed, smoked a little from the friction, and then, with a sucking sound that seemed to come from the very gut of the earth, it caught. The wagon shuddered, fought its way free, and rolled onto solid, frozen ground. Calder let the mule take 5 steps before stopping her. He climbed back onto the bench, his hands aching, the damp from the pine needles already freezing stiff inside his gloves. Prospector's Rest appeared as a smudge of bitter smoke against a steel-gray sky. It was a town built on desperation, clinging to the side of a mountain that promised more than it gave. Wooden storefronts, gray and unpainted, leaned against each other for support. Signs swung on rusty chains, their groans adding to the voice of the wind. Harridan Supply, the Golden Sluice, Marshall. What Calder saw first, what made his stomach tighten, was the line. It wasn't a line for the saloon or the assay office. It was a line for Harridan's general supply. It snaked from the single door, 30, maybe 40 people, huddled in coats, their faces pinched and gray. The rumor he'd heard at the last crossroad had been true. The freight wagon from Cheyenne, the last one before the pass closed for good, was trapped, snowed in. What was on the shelves in that store was all there was. A current of quiet panic ran through the crowd. This was not a gathering of neighbors. It was a collection of competitors. They watched each other. They watched the door. They watched the unforgiving sky. Calder could hear scraps of their talk. Heard the passes snowed in till April. Harridan's doubling the price on flour. Mark my words. Man can't feed his stock, let alone his family. Calder pulled Clara to a halt near the town's central trough. It was frozen solid, a thick, milky cap of ice over its brim. He set the brake. "Stay," he told the children, his voice firm. "Do not get down, no matter what. I'll be quick as I can." Milo just nodded, his dark eyes wide, taking in the line, the tension. Rosie had pulled the blanket completely over her head. Calder swung down, his boots heavy on the packed snow of the street. He was walking toward the end of the line, calculating how much time he had, how much money. When he saw her, she was kneeling, not by the church, which was dark and cold, but in the alley mud between Harridan's and the assay office. The mud was a foul slurry of snowmelt, tobacco spit, and mule droppings. She was almost invisible, a shadow in the larger shadow of the buildings. The people in the line, only 10 yards away, ignored her. They looked through her, around her, as if she were a post, a stray dog, a thing not worthy of sight. She was a bride, or had been. The dress was a pale, grayish blue, the kind of dress a woman might have made herself for a day she prayed would be special, a day of hope. The hope was gone. The hem was black with filth, and the fabric at the knee was torn, exposing raw, red skin that looked painful in the cold. She was whispering, her head bowed, her hair a dark, rich chestnut falling in damp tangles over her face. Calder stopped. His boots made a crunching sound. He was close enough to hear the words, breathed out into the freezing air like a final prayer, the last ember of a dying fire. "Please, have mercy!" He stood there, rooted, the cold forgotten. A man in the line spat, the brown stream freezing almost instantly on the ground. Nobody looked at her. Then she looked up, not at him, but at the sound of his boots stopping. It was the eyes that held him. They were not begging. Calder had seen beggars in Cheyenne. This was different. Her eyes were hollow, dark with a hunger that went past food, but they were defiant. She was drowning, but she was still fighting the current. Her face was fine-boned, sharp, made sharper by starvation. Her chin was smeared with mud, but she held it up. Her back, even kneeling in the filth, was straight. This was not a woman asking for a handout. This was a woman stating a fact mercy was required, and it was nowhere to be found. The door of Harridan's supply scraped open, spilling a wave of yellow light and the rich smell of coffee beans and cured meat onto the street. Marshal Deke Romley stepped out. He was a big man, his bulk emphasized by a thick buffalo coat that made him seem wider than the door. He held a steaming tin cup of coffee. He saw the line, nodded, his face impassive. Then his eyes landed on the woman, his face soured. He took a long, loud sip of his coffee before speaking. "You're still here, girl." His voice was gravelly, used to being obeyed, a voice that carried over the wind. The woman in the mud flinched, a small, tight movement, but she did not move. "I told you to clear off." Romley took a step toward her. He didn't look angry. He looked annoyed, like he'd found a stray dog sleeping on his porch. "You're defiling the storefront. It's bad for business. Folks don't want to see this." He gestured with his cup, splashing hot coffee on the snow. "Go on. Get. Whatever hole you crawled out of, crawl back in." The woman's shoulders hitched. She placed her hands in the mud and tried to push herself up. Her hands slipped. She fell back onto her haunches, a quiet, desperate sound escaping her, a gasp of humiliation. Calder felt something shift in his chest, a heavy, cold anger that started in his gut. He looked at the marshal. He looked at the line of silent, watching faces. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They had their own problems. The cold, the line, the scarce flour. This was just one more piece of misery, and it wasn't theirs. He felt a tug on his sleeve, a small, insistent pull. He looked down. Milo had gotten out of the wagon. He stood beside him, so small, his own coat too big for him. His small face was pale, his eyes fixed on the woman, then on the marshal, then on his father. "Pa!" Milo's voice was small, barely a whisper against the wind, a child's sound in a world that was hard and adult. Calder put his heavy, gloved hand on his son's shoulder. "Back in the wagon, son, now." "Pa!" Milo said again, his voice trembling now, with cold or fear. Calder couldn't tell. He didn't move. He pointed with his chin. "Why ain't nobody helping?" The question was simple. It was a child's question, born of a world that should have made sense, that should have been fair, and it pierced Calder Holt straight through his leather coat, past the ribs, and into the very center of his heart. It was the same question he had asked himself when May's breath grew shallow. It was the question of a good man in a hard world. He looked at the marshal, who was turning back to the store, satisfied he had done his duty. He looked at the bride, who had her face hidden in her muddy, trembling hands. And he looked at his son, who was waiting for an answer. Calder took his hand off his son's shoulder. He took a step forward, away from the wagon, away from the line, and toward the mud. Calder Holt did not go to the back of the line. He turned from his son, his face set like a fresh forging, and walked back to his wagon. The wind tore at his coat, trying to push him back, but Calder moved against it with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who has measured his world in heavy, deliberate blows. Milo scrambled back into the wagon bed, his small face a knot of confusion and fear, and burrowed next to Rosie, who had not moved. From under the driver's bench, Calder pulled a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. It was their own provision, the last of May's recipe. A dense, dark loaf of cornbread made with molasses. It was meant for their supper, for the long, cold ride back to the bend. He unwrapped it, the coarse linen stiff with cold. He walked past the line. He felt the eyes of the 40 or more townsfolk, a collective weight of disapproval and curiosity. They were cold, they were hungry, and this interruption, this break in the common suffering, was an offense. He ignored them. He walked through the invisible wall of their judgment and stopped, his shadow falling over the kneeling woman. She had her head down again, her shoulders shaking, but she made no sound. His boots crunched in the frozen mud beside her. He bent, not all the way, just a smith's crouch. He placed the dark loaf on the ground, beside her torn, mud-caked shoe. It was a simple, solid thing in a world of gray slush. She flinched at the movement. Her head came up slowly, her tangled chestnut hair parting. Her eyes, wide and startled, focused on the bread. It was a look of pure, animal disbelief. Then her eyes darted up to his face, to the rough-cut beard, the soot in the lines of his skin, the unreadable calm of his expression. She was looking for the trick, the price. Calder touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of respect that was so out of place it felt like a gunshot. "This ain't charity," he said, his voice low, not meant for the line, but the wind carried it anyway. "It's a debt, man to man." He did not clarify. He did not need to. In this land, survival was a debt passed between strangers, a debt that could be called in by the sight of a child's hunger or a woman's desperation. Before she could speak, before her hand could even twitch toward the bread, another voice cut the air, sharp and sour. "Holt, you're a fool. Don't touch her." Ephra Harridan stood in the doorway of his store, a small, pinched man whose wealth came from measuring out survival in tiny, expensive scoops. He wore a clean white apron over a wool suit, and he looked at the woman with pure, undisguised disgust. "She's bad luck, that one," Harridan spat, his voice rising to carry to the line, "to make this a public spectacle. Brought nothing but trouble. Came in on the afternoon coach, and she's been weeping in the street ever since. Tricks men clean, that's her trade. The woman's head snapped toward Harridan. The hunger in her eyes was replaced by a sudden, hot fire. "That is a lie," she said. Her voice was thin, cracked with cold and thirst, but it was clear. It was the voice of someone educated. "Is it?" Marshal Romley stepped forward, planting himself between Calder and the woman, his big buffalo coat smelling of stale whiskey and authority. He waved his empty cup toward her. "You're the one in the mud, girl. The town has rules." She started, her voice trembling. "I was left. It was a false wedding." "We've heard that story," Harridan sneered from the doorway. "Groom and the preacher just vanished poof like magic. She was a mail order, Marshal. Likely she tried to squeeze the man for more coin before the ink was dry, and he had the good sense to bolt." "I am Lydia Marlowe," the woman said, her voice gaining a desperate strength. She was talking to Calder, only to Calder. "I was brought here to be married. The man, his name was Silas Brand. The ceremony was at the hotel just an hour ago. And then he and the man who called himself a preacher, they left. They took my trunk. They took my return passage. They left me." "A sad story," Romley said, his tone bored. He'd heard 1,000 of them. "But it ain't your story that's the problem, miss. It's your presence." He turned his gaze on Calder. It was a warning. Prospectors' Rest Ordinance, Section 4, Public Vagrancy and Moral Disturbance. "I can lock her up for 30 days to protect the town's character. And," he added, his voice dropping, "any man who interferes, who gives aid or shelter, is guilty of the same, inducing moral disturbance. That's a $50 fine. Holt, you got $50 on you for this. This piece of alley trash?" The word hung in the air. Trash. Calder hadn't moved. His gaze shifted from Romley's hard, impatient face to the woman. Lydia. He was weighing the marshal's words. $50 was more than he had. It was ruination. It was the cost of his forge. The line of people watched, silent. This was the drama they had been waiting for, a break in the monotony of the cold. They were a jury, and they had already passed sentence. She was guilty. Guilty of being poor, of being abandoned, of being a problem. A small, quiet sound broke the tableau. A dry cough, and the shuffle of wool on snow. "Ephra, your cruelty is louder than your scales, and the Lord knows they're loud enough." Sister Althea, the old nun who ran the town infirmary out of a 2-room shack near the church, had appeared as if from the snow itself. She was ancient, her face a road map of wrinkles, her black habit faded and patched. But when she spoke, even Marshal Romley looked uncomfortable. She ignored the marshal and the shopkeeper, walking directly to Calder. She was so small she barely reached his chest. She put a chapped, frail hand on his forearm. "Calder," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp, meant only for him. "That one." She nodded at Lydia. "She's not what they say. She rode in 2 weeks back with the O'Bannon wagon train. They left her here, said her groom was paying for her passage. But she didn't just ride. She worked." Calder waited. "She was their reader," Sister Althea said, her pale eyes sharp. "She read the letters for the men who couldn't, read them the scriptures on Sunday, and the dime novels on weekdays. The wagon boss said she had more letters in her head than a print shop. She's sharp. Calder, too sharp, maybe, for a town like this." The old nun squeezed his arm. A brief, urgent pressure, and then she stepped back. Her duty done, her small piece of truth laid on the scales. Calder looked at Lydia. She was watching him, her face a mask of desperation and pride. She had heard the nun. She had seen her chance. Her gaze flickered from Calder's face to the wagon, where 2 small, watchful faces, one boy and one girl, peered over the side. Her expression changed. The desperation hardened into resolve. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about them. She saw what he was, a father. Lydia Marlowe pushed her hands into the mud and, with a painful, awkward lurch, She got her feet under her. She stood. She was taller than he thought, though thin as a reed. She swayed, but she did not fall. She was covered in filth, her fine blue-gray dress ruined, her hands and face smeared, but she was standing. "I don't need pity," she said, her voice clear and carrying. Aimed past Romley, past Harridan, straight at Calder Holt, she took one unsteady step out of the alley's shadow. "I work." She listed her skills like a blacksmith listing his tools. "I can cook, I can clean, I can mend. And I see you have children. I can teach letters. I can read any book printed. And I can write a fair hand. I am not trash." Her voice broke on the last word. But she did not cry. She bit her lip, the defiance back in her eyes, brighter this time, fueled by the bread she had not yet touched. The line of people murmured. A woman in a man's coat laughed, a short, harsh sound. Calder looked at her. He saw the filth, the cold, the desperation. But he also saw the straight spine. He saw the fire. He saw the letters Sister Althea spoke of. His own May had been able to read, but he could only make his mark. Milo, at 9, could barely write his name. "My place needs hands," Calder said, his voice flat, a statement of fact. It was not an offer of salvation. It was a trade. "You'll eat by your strength. You'll sleep by your labor." Lydia held his gaze. She nodded once, a sharp, definite motion. The bargain was struck. "Well, ain't that sweet?" Harridan's voice dripped with scorn. "The blacksmith's hauling trash home. You'll regret this. Holt, the whole town will mark me." Calder ignored him. He turned his back on the shopkeeper, on the marshal, on the silent, judging line. He walked into Harridan's store, breaking the line, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floor. The line parted for him. He was a man of few words, but his presence was heavy, solid as the anvil in his forge. He slapped his thin coin sack on the counter. "Flour," he said to Harridan, who had scurried back behind his counter. "Salt, and the box of 4440 cartridges." Harridan's eyes flicked to Marshal Romley, who stood in the doorway, watching, his face unreadable. Romley gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shrug. This was business, not as Harridan, his face sour, measured out the flour, his hands moving with angry, jerky motions. He took Calder's money, all of it. Calder took the heavy 100-pound sack of flour, heaving it to his shoulder in one smooth, practiced motion. He tucked the small bag of salt and the box of bullets under his other arm. He walked out of the store, past the marshal, past the glares of the line. He didn't stop at his wagon. He walked back to where Lydia Marlowe stood, still trembling, by the loaf of bread. She looked up at him, fear and hope warring in her eyes. Calder Holt didn't smile. He wasn't a man given to smiles. He just shifted the weight of the flour on his shoulder and nodded toward his wagon, toward the two small faces watching. "Get in the wagon," he said, his voice low and rough. But for the first time, it wasn't aimed at the wind. "It's cold here, but their words are colder." The journey back to Holt's Bend was a study in silence. The wind had the only voice, a high, lonely shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Calder Holt kept his eyes on the narrow, winding track, his shoulders set against the cold. Beside him, Lydia Marlowe sat rigid, her hands twisting in the lap of her ruined dress. She had climbed into the wagon without a word, her movements stiff and pained. She had found the loaf of cornbread, still on the muddy ground, and had clutched it to her chest as if it were a shield. In the back, Milo and Rosie were hidden beneath the buffalo hide, two small, warm lumps. But Calder knew they were not sleeping. They were listening to the new, strange silence of this woman, a silence that was heavier than the snow-laden clouds above. They left Prospector's Rest behind, a smudge of gray smoke that was quickly swallowed by the trees. The track narrowed, climbing into the foothills, following the deep, frozen gorge of the Pine Jaw Creek. The creek was named for the jagged, tooth-like stones that lined its bed, and the homestead, Holt's Bend, was named for the sharp, Unforgiving turn the water took around Calder's land. After another hour, the trees thinned. A clearing opened, dominated by two structures. One was the forge, a broad, open-sided shed, its great anvil silent and dusted with snow, its belly cold. The other was the house. It was not a cabin, it was a house, built of thick, saddle-notched logs, the gaps chinked tight with mud and straw. It was solid, square, and defiant. A low-roofed stable leaned against the far side, and a square patch of ground, the summer vegetable garden, was a smooth, desolate white rectangle. Calder pulled Clara to a halt. He set the brake. "We're here," he said to the air. He swung down and, without looking at Lydia, went to the mule. He unfastened the heavy harness, his movements efficient, his chapped hands gentle on the animal. He led Clara into the stable, his first duty always to his livestock. Lydia sat frozen on the wagon bench. She watched him go. This was it. This was the end of the line. She watched Milo and Rosie crawl out from under the blankets. They slid over the side of the wagon, their feet landing softly in the snow, and ran for the house, their small boots making no sound. The door opened, a rectangle of warm, orange light, and swallowed them. Calder emerged from the stable. He looked at her, still sitting there, clutching the bread. "You can come in," he said. It was not an invitation. It was a fact. The wood needs splitting before dark. Lydia's legs were numb. She climbed down, her whole body aching with a cold that felt bone deep. She stumbled, catching herself on the wagon wheel. The mud on her dress was frozen stiff, a hard, cracked shell. She followed him to the door, the loaf still in her arms. The house was one room, one large, warm, shadowed room. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall. A bed of coals glowing red. A long table made of split pine stood in the center. In one corner was a large, rope-strung bed, Calder's. In the other was a smaller truckle bed where Milo and Rosie were already shedding their coats. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and faintly of bacon. And on a peg by the door, a woman's cloak. It was dark blue, heavy wool with a simple wooden clasp. It was the only soft, distinctly female thing in the room, and it owned the space. Lydia's eyes fixed on it. This was May's house. She was an intruder, a piece of mud tracked in from the street. Calder saw her look. He said nothing. He gestured with his chin toward a steep, rough-hewn ladder leading to the darkness above. "The loft. There's a cot." Lydia nodded. She climbed. The loft was low-ceilinged, cold, the air still and smelling of dried herbs and dust. There, as promised, was a narrow cot, a straw-stuffed mattress, and a few thin blankets. It was pressed between two crude shelves built into the eaves. The shelves were filled with books. Their spines were broken, their pages swollen and water-stained. She could make out a few titles in the dim light. A Bible. The Pilgrim's Progress. A thick, battered volume on animal husbandry. Beside the cot, under the sloping roof, was a simple wooden chest, May's chest. It was closed. It was a statement. Lydia understood. This small, cold space was hers. But the memories belonged to someone else. She heard Calder's voice from below. "Rosie, Milo, water buckets, now!" Lydia came back down the ladder. Calder was stoking the fire, adding logs from a large wood bin. The children were struggling into their coats again. Lydia put the loaf of bread on the table. "I can," she said, her voice hoarse. Calder stopped, the poker in his hand. The children paused, their hands frozen on their buttons. "I can get the water," she clarified. Calder looked at her, at the ruined dress, the frozen mud. He looked at her hands, which were fine-boned, not made for this work. He nodded once, a curt motion. He pointed. "Pump is by the stable. Don't let the handle freeze." She took the two heavy wooden buckets and went back out into the biting wind. The pump was iron, its handle so cold it burned her skin even through her thin, torn gloves. It took all her weight to break the ice in the mechanism and draw the water up. It was a physical, grounding pain. She filled the buckets, her arms screaming at the weight, and hauled them back. When she returned, Calder was gone, the sound of his axe splitting wood echoing from behind the house. Rosie and Milo were watching her from the truckle bed. Lydia ignored them. She saw a basin on a dry sink. She poured a little water into it. She found a bar of harsh, yellow lye soap. She untied her bonnet, her fingers clumsy and numb, and let it fall. She submerged her hands in the icy water and began, methodically, to scrub. She washed her hands, her arms, and then, taking a deep breath, she scrubbed her face, washing away the mud, the tears, and the humiliation of Prospector's Rest. When she was done, her skin was raw and red, but she was herself. She found the sack of beans and a slab of salt pork. She found the heavy, black iron soup pot. She did not need to be told. She sliced the pork and set it to render. The sizzle and snap a sudden, welcome violence in the quiet. By the time Calder returned, his arms loaded with split logs, the cabin was filled with the rich smell of beans and fat. He stopped, just inside the door, and watched her. She was stirring the pot, her back to him, her movements economical and sure. He stacked the wood without a word. They ate at the long table, Calder, Lydia, and the two children. The meal was bean soup, thick with pork, and slices of the cornbread she'd been given. It was hot, salty, and utterly basic. To Lydia, it was a feast. She ate slowly, feeling the warmth spread through her. A slow, painful thawing. The children were quiet. Rosie picked at her beans, pushing them around her wooden bowl. Milo ate quickly, his eyes down, suspicion in every line of his small body. Lydia watched Rosie. The child looked pale, her small face pinched. Lydia put her spoon down. "You shouldn't just eat them," she whispered. Rosie looked up, her eyes wide and startled. "You must count them first," Lydia said, her voice soft. "They are stars. Did you know?" Rosie shook her head, her braids swishing. They're little stars that fell into the soup pot. They fell from the sky to keep us warm. See?" Lydia pointed with her spoon into her own bowl. "There is one and another. You must count your stars before you eat them, or the wish doesn't work." A small, confused smile touched Rosie's lips. "Oh, wish. Of course. Count them." Rosie bent her head and, in a tiny whisper, began. 1, 2, 3. She looked at Lydia, her eyes suddenly bright. "I have 7 stars. Then it will be a very strong wish," Lydia said, and she smiled. A small, cracked smile that hurt her face. Rosie giggled. It was a sound like a small, rusty bell, but it was a giggle. Milo looked up, his suspicion momentarily forgotten, and stared at his sister. Calder, at the head of the table, stopped with his spoon halfway to his mouth. He did not look at Lydia. He just listened to the sound. That night, the sleeping arrangements were made in silence. The children climbed into their bed. Calder laid his gun belt on the table and sat on his own bed, pulling off his boots. Lydia retreated to the loft. She lay on the thin cot, fully dressed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. The wind howled against the roof, a low, constant moan. The house groaned, settling in the cold. Then, from the truckle bed, came a cough. It was small, dry, and hacking. Rosie. Lydia stiffened. Down below, she heard Calder shift, the ropes of his bed creaking. The cough came again, sharper, a memory, hot and terrible, of a fever ward, of her own mother, rose in Lydia's throat. She did not think. She sat up, and in the cold, dark loft, she began to sing. Her voice was thin, not powerful, but clear as ice water. It was an old hymn, one her mother had loved. Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. Down below, all movement stopped. The coughing paused, as if the child was listening. Lydia continued, her voice gaining a little strength, the notes finding their way into the shadowed corners of the room. She sang of shelter, of a fortress against the storm. The song was a thread, and she was, as the outline said, sewing up the torn and ragged edges of the day, of their lives. When the hymn was finished, the silence that followed was different. It was not empty. It was full. The coughing did not return. Soon, the only sounds were the deep, even breathing of two children and the endless, lonely voice of the wind. The next day, the rhythm was set. Calder was gone before dawn, the clang of his hammer on the anvil ringing through the frozen air. It was the homestead's heartbeat. Lydia came down to a cold room and a live ambered fire. She built it up. She boiled the bitter coffee. She made oatmeal for the children. After they ate, Calder came in, his face grim. The snowdrift broke the top rail of the corral. He took his heavy post-hole digger and went out. Lydia looked at Milo, who was standing by the door, aimless. She remembered the nun's words. She has letters. She found a piece of charcoal from the woodbin and a flat, discarded shingle. She sat Milo on the porch steps, bundled in his coat, the spot sheltered from the worst of the wind. "Your father is a good man," she said, her fingers stiff as she gripped the charcoal. Milo shrugged, his eyes on the snow. "He's mean sometimes." "He is strong," Lydia corrected, brushing snow off the shingle. "There is a difference. Do you know what this word is?" She wrote, her hand slow and precise. "Courage." Milo squinted. He knew his letters, but not the word. "Courage," Lydia said. "It is a word for what your father does. It means you are cold, and you are tired, and you are afraid, but you go out and fix the fence anyway. Because it must be done." Milo looked at the word. He looked at his father, a dark, laboring figure in the snow. He looked at this strange, quiet woman. He reached out and touched the sea. "Courage," he whispered. He looked up at her, his eyes serious, the suspicion gone, replaced by a deep, 9-year-old gravity. "Yes, ma'am." It was the first time he had called her anything. It was a small thing, a single word, but it was a foundation stone. She looked up from the lesson and saw the woodshed. The wind, in the night, had peeled back a section of the shingles, leaving the wood beneath exposed. She knew what snow and wind would do to that. She found Calder's hammer. She found a small keg of roofing nails. She climbed the ladder to the low woodshed roof. Her dress, one of May's she had found in the chest, a practical, faded calico that was too large in the shoulders, snagged and whipped around her legs. She knelt on the icy wood, her hands already numb, and began to work. She pulled the first loose shingle. Clang, thud, Calder, at the far end of the corral. Set a new post. Tap, tap, tap. Lydia set the first nail. They worked all morning. Two silent figures at opposite ends of the homestead. The thud of his post driver. The tap of her hammer. They did not speak. They did not need to. The wind was the enemy, and they were together, mending the armor of the house. It was a harmony of labor, an unspoken agreement. That evening, as the light failed, Lydia went to the line of pine trees that bordered the creek. She broke off a single, small, green sprig. She came back inside, snow on her shoulders. The children were setting the table. Calder was washing his hands in the basin, the soot turning the water gray. Lydia walked to the peg by the door. She stood for a moment, looking at the dark blue wool of May's cloak. Then, gently, with a reverence that was almost a prayer, she tucked the small pine sprig under the wooden hook, just above the collar. It was not a replacement. It was an offering, a small piece of green life, a sign of respect for the woman whose house she now shared. Calder saw the movement. He stopped, his hands in the water. He saw the green against the dark wood. He said nothing, but when he sat down to supper, the hard line of his jaw seemed, just for a moment, to soften. Later, the children asleep, they sat by the fire. The snow had begun again, hissing against the single window pane, piling on the roof. Calder sharpened a skinning knife, the shing-shing-shing of the whetstone a sharp counterpoint to the wind. Lydia was mending one of Milo's socks, the needle flashing in the firelight. Calder looked at her, at the quiet industry of her hands, at the proud, straight line of her back. A hungry woman begs, he thought. He had seen that woman in the mud of Prospector's Rest. But a proud soul asks for work. He was looking at that woman now. A heavy whump from above made Lydia jump, her eyes flashing to the ceiling. A load of snow had slid from the main peak. Calder didn't look up from his knife. "The beams will hold," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I cut them myself." Lydia looked at the heavy, dark beams, and then at the man. She believed him. The wind howled, a beast trying to get in, but inside the house, the fire burned. The walls were tight, and the roof, newly mended, held. 4 strangers, bound by a blizzard and a bargain, had become a temporary household. A week passed. The snow did not return. A false spring, a January thaw, as the old-timers called it, settled over the land. The ice on the Pine Jaw Creek cracked and boomed in the night, and the snow on the roof of the house began to slide in heavy, wet sheets. Calder's forge rang from dawn until dusk. He was working a heavy order for the Double Bar K Ranch, mending branding irons and wagon wheels, work that would buy them another month. But as the physical world thawed, the social world of Prospector's Rest froze solid. News, like meltwater, finds every crack. The story of Calder Holt, the reclusive blacksmith. Taking in the ruined bride from Harridan's Alley became the town's primary currency. It was traded over saloon bars, whispered in the general store, and dissected over sewing circles. And, like all currency, it was polished and embellished until it bore little resemblance to the truth. She was a grifter from Copper Vale, they said, known for charming men and stealing their war pensions. She was a runaway, a mail-order bride who had skipped out on a good man in Cheyenne, taking his passage money with her. Harridan, nursing his wounded pride, fanned the flames, suggesting she was diseased, a moral contagion that threatened the good families of the rest. The rumors traveled the 12 miles to Holt's Bend on the back of a horse. Jedediah Miller, a rancher whose land bordered Calder's to the north, stopped by the forge, ostensibly to have a horseshoe checked. "Mighty busy, Calder," he said, hooking a thumb in his suspenders, his eyes drifting toward the house, where Lydia was hanging laundry in the brief, pale sun. "Work's work," Calder said, not stopping the rhythm of his hammer. "Some work is more trouble than it's worth," Jedediah offered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "Town's uneasy. Folks are saying you're harboring a fugitive." Calder's hammer stopped. He set the hot iron on the anvil, the metal hissing, and turned his full, quiet attention to the man. "Folks say a lot of things when the pass is closed," fills the silence. "This ain't just silence, son." Jedediah looked uncomfortable. Harridan's got a long memory, and Marshal Romley's been spending a lot of time with Judge Tillman, and Silas Brand is back in town. Calder's face did not change. Brand. Aye. The rancher from over the divide, the one with the big house and the bad reputation. Word is, he's the one she inconvenienced. Jedediah shrugged. His duty as a neighbor done, just watch your back. Holt, land and women. They're the only 2 things that'll get a man killed out here quicker than winter. Calder nodded once. "Appreciate the warning, Jed." He watched the rancher ride off. Land and women. He looked at the house. Lydia was bringing the children inside. He had not touched her, had not offered more than the basic courtesy of shelter, but in that moment, he knew the town had already made them a couple, and in doing so, had made them a target. The official trouble arrived 2 days later. Calder was in the stable, reshoeing Clara, when Milo ran in, his face white. "Pa, the marshal, he's here. He ain't alone." Calder put down the hoof. "Stay in here, Milo. Do not come out." He wiped his hands on a rag and walked into the clearing. Marshal Deke Romley was sitting on his big roan horse, his buffalo coat making him look like a bear. Beside him, also mounted, was Ephra Harridan, looking pinched and cold, and standing by the porch, his hand resting on the rail as if he already owned it, was a man Calder did not know. He was tall, dressed in a tailored black coat with a velvet collar, his face clean-shaven and handsome in a sharp, predatory way. His gray eyes were fixed on the door. Lydia was standing in that doorway, her hand on the frame, her body rigid. Halt, Romley said, his voice flat. He swung down from his horse. He wasn't bored or annoyed this time. He was official. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. This is a legal matter. This is my land, Marshal, Calder said, stopping 10 feet from him. State your business. My business, the stranger said, his voice smooth and cultured, is that you are harboring my wife. Lydia made a small, choked sound. I am not your wife. Silas Brand, the man said, introducing himself to Calder, ignoring Lydia. And this, he gestured to Romley, is a writ of protection, signed and sealed by Judge Tillman himself. It orders you, Calder Holt, to surrender the person of Lydia Marlowe, my lawfully wedded wife, into my protection and custody. Lydia stepped out onto the porch. It was a lie. It was a false ceremony. He is not my husband. Romley unfolded the paper. That's not what the judge says. He's reviewed Mr. Brand's claim. Seems there was a preacher, a witness, a signed certificate, all legal and proper. You are Mrs. Silas Brand, and you are trespassing on this man's property. He nodded at Calder. Lydia's mind went white-hot, flashing back to that terrible hour at the hotel. Silas Brand, smelling of whiskey and bay rum, his smile all teeth. The other man, the preacher, with watery eyes and a book he barely glanced at. The witness, a rough man who had stood by the door. After the I-do's, after the preacher had been paid and had vanished, Brand had turned to her. He had grabbed her wrist. Now, Mrs. Brand, he had said, his voice dropping, his thumb rubbing the inside of her arm. We'll dispense with the niceties. I've paid for you. You will honor your side of the bargain. I demand my ownership rights. She had recoiled, and his face had changed, the handsome mask twisting into something ugly. She had fled, and he had let her. He had known, even then, that he had her trapped. He's lying, she whispered, her voice shaking, her eyes on Calder. It was a performance. It was a sham. The law says different, Romley said, impatient. Now, Holt, give us the woman. Don't make this difficult. Calder didn't look at Lydia. He looked at Harridan, who was smiling, a thin, satisfied smirk. He looked at Brand, who was watching Lydia with a look of possessive hunger. And he looked at Romley. No, Calder said. The silence that followed was absolute. Harridan's smile faltered. Romley's hand drifted to the butt of his pistol. Halt, Romley said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. Don't be a fool. This ain't your fight. You're on my land, Marshal, and the woman is under my roof. She's working for her keep. That makes it my fight. You don't understand what you're stepping in, blacksmith, Brand said, his smooth voice hardening. This is bigger than you? Maybe you should explain it then, Calder said. Romley took a step forward. Fine. You want it plain? I'll give it to you plain. Judge Tillman was reviewing the territorial maps last week. Seems your father's original claim. There's a discrepancy, a marker error. Calder's blood ran cold. Your boundary, Romley continued. The one that follows the creek. It seems your bend isn't as wide as you think. This whole section. He gestured to the house, the forge. Might be off claim by 20 yards. Might be territorial land. Or, he paused, it might be land available for a new claim. And by pure coincidence, Brand added. The Frontier and Divide Railroad is looking for a spur line right through this valley. They need clear title. They pay well for it. The trap was sprung. It was clean, brutal, and total. They wanted his land. Lydia was just the key, the lever. But we are reasonable men, Brand said. This is just a misunderstanding about a woman. And a debt, Harridan chirped, sliding off his horse. He, too, produced a piece of paper. A long, itemized bill. You're behind. Holt, your account here. All that flour, the salt, the bullets. Not to mention your father's old debts I was good enough to carry. It's a hefty sum. I'm afraid my good nature has run out. I'm calling it in. All of it. Due in. 5 days. You can't, Calder said. his voice tight. "I can," Harridan said, his eyes glittering. "I can, and I will. I'll have the marshal foreclose. You'll lose the forge, the house, everything." He tapped the paper. "Unless you show some good sense. Cooperate. Give Mr. Brand his property. And perhaps I can be persuaded to grant an extension. Perhaps Mr. Brand would even be willing to help with your boundary problem." Calder was surrounded. They had him by his land, by his debt, and by his honor. He looked at Lydia. She was shaking, her face ashen. She understood. She was the price for his survival. "I will not go," she said. "You don't have a choice. Mrs. Brand." Brand said. He took a step toward the porch. Calder moved, blocking his path. He was not a big man, not like Romley, but he was solid. He was made of iron and quiet rage. "You're not taking her. I have a writ." "Halt!" Romley shouted, his hand on his gun. "You defy that. You're defying the law. I'll have you in chains." The standoff held for a long, terrible moment. The blacksmith against the law, the landowner, and the merchant. "Give me time," Calder said, his voice a low growl. "You want her. You want this land. You won't get either by gunfire. Romley, it'll bring the federal marshals down from Cheyenne, and they won't like Tillman's paperwork." He was bluffing. Maybe. Romley hesitated. He looked at Brand. Brand was angry. His handsome face flushed. He wanted to take her, but he also wanted the land, and he wanted it clean. 3 days, Brand said. "I'll give you 3 days to read the writ and see reason. I'll be at the hotel in town. You bring her to me. Holt, you bring me my wife, and we'll forget this unpleasantness. Harridan will extend your note. The boundary will be corrected. 3 days, Romley affirmed. And then I come back, and I won't be asking." He pinned the writ to the door with a nail, the paper fluttering in the wind. Then they mounted, turned their horses, and rode away, leaving a toxic silence behind them. That night, the house was a tomb. Lydia did not cook. Calder did not stoke the fire. The children, who had watched the entire scene from the window, were silent in their bed. Lydia finally spoke, her voice dead. "You must let them take me. He's right. It's not your fight. You'll lose your home, your children's home." "He'll lose it anyway," Calder said, staring into the low coals. "This was never about you. You were just the opportunity. They've wanted this land since the railroad surveyors came through. They just needed a way to break me." "So, what do we do?" she whispered. "I don't know." The knock at the door made them both jump. Calder grabbed the rifle from above the mantel. "Who's there?" "It's Althea. Put the gun down. Calder, you'll scare the saints." He opened the door. Sister Althea slipped in, a small, dark shadow. She was breathing hard, her face pale. "I saw them ride back, Brand and his snakes. They've trapped him." "Sister," Lydia said, her voice breaking. "Hush, child. The devil is clever, but God is patient." She pulled something from her sleeve, a torn, crumpled envelope. "I found this after you left town. Harridan threw it in the trash bin behind the store, but I saw the postmark." She handed it to Calder. It was addressed to Miss Lydia Marlowe, care of the Prospector's Rest Hotel. The postmark was clear U.S. mail, dated 6 weeks prior from a town in Ohio. It was slit open, and the letter was gone, but the envelope was proof. He told me he never received it," Lydia whispered, her hand to her mouth. "That was my letter, my real letter, to the man I was supposed to marry, Silas Brand. I sent it to confirm the arrangements. He must have gotten it. He knew I was coming. He set this all up." "And," Sister Althea said, her voice hard, "he intercepted U.S. mail to do it. That's not Judge Tillman's territory. That's a federal crime." It was a small thing, a torn envelope, but it was a different kind of weapon. It was the truth. Calder looked at it. He looked at Lydia. The helplessness began to recede. replaced by the cold, calculating mind of a smith. A smith doesn't just hit hot iron. He finds the stress points, the flaws. "Lydia," he said, his voice quiet, "you said you can write a clear hand." "Yes, write what happened. Everything. The fake preacher. The letter. What Brand said. Ownership rights. Write it all." He left before dawn. He rode Clara not to Prospector's Rest, but north, to the tiny, wind-blasted outpost of Buckhorn Station. It was nothing but a trading post and a telegraph office. Inside, a young man, barely 19, named Toby Quince, was asleep on his cot. "Toby," Calder said, shaking him awake. "Mr. Holt, what's wrong?" "I need you to send a message. To Cheyenne. To the U.S. Federal Courthouse." Toby sat up, instantly awake. That's official business. Mr. Holt. And it costs." Calder put his last real coin on the table. A silver dollar. "Send this, and send it fast. And, Toby, don't tell anyone you sent it." Calder dictated the message. He quoted the writ. He named Romley, Tillman, and Brand. He told Lydia's story in short, sharp bursts. He mentioned the intercepted U.S. mail. He asked one question at the end. "Does a territorial writ of protection supersede federal law and a citizen's right to safety?" The key began to chatter, the sound thin and fast in the cold morning air. When Calder returned, Lydia was waiting on the porch. She had washed her face, and she was wearing May's work dress, but she had mended the shoulder to fit. She looked as if she belonged. "You risked everything," she said. "They already risked it for me," he replied. He looked at her, at the fear still in her eyes, but also at the strength in her jaw, a strength that matched his own. She took a shaky breath. Her hands were trembling, but she clasped them in front of her. Her chin came up. "I do not belong to him," she said, her voice clear and strong. A declaration to the mountains, to the wind. "I belong to no one." Calder looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not a refugee, but an equal. This was his land, this was his forge, and this was, now, his fight. That night, the warning came. He heard Clara shifting in the stable, a nervous, unhappy sound. He took his rifle and went out. The moon was a sliver, the shadows deep. He checked the horses, soothed the mule. Nothing. He was about to leave when he saw it. One of his best harnesses, the one he used for hauling ore, was hanging from its peg. But it was not in one piece. The main trace, a thick 2-inch wide leather strap, had been cut clean through. It wasn't a ragged tear. It was a single, smooth cut from a very sharp knife. They hadn't taken anything. They hadn't hurt his stock. They had just left a message. A quiet, personal, and brutal warning. "We were here. We can get to what you value. You are not safe." The cut harness lay on the forge floor, a coiled snake of leather and malice. Calder had brought it inside, dropping it by the hearth. It was a tangible piece of the threat, a violation that filled the small room with a new, cold tension. The 3-day deadline was a clock ticking in his head. And now this. "We can get to you." That night, the sky changed. The false thaw vanished as if a door had been slammed, and the true, high-country winter returned with a vengeance. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. The wind, which had been a whisper, rose to a scream. It came from the north, a solid wall of moving ice and air. The storm hit not as a gentle snow, but as an assault. It was a blizzard, arriving a week before the almanac had guessed. Calder had smelled it, a sharp, metallic bite in the air, and had spent the afternoon working with a grim, hurried intensity. "Lydia the wood, all of it," he had bellowed, his voice barely carrying from the woodpile. "Milo, the pump, fill every bucket. Every pot, Rosie, twist straw. We'll need it for the door." They worked as a single, desperate unit. Calder and Lydia hauled the livestock into the stable, which was barely large enough, packing Clara, the 2 draft horses, and the milk cow into the tight, warm dark. They barred the heavy door. They stacked the last of the split firewood on the porch, a bulwark against the wind. Milo. his small face set in a mask of concentration. Worked the pump handle until his arm shook, filling the water barrel. By the time full dark fell, the world outside had vanished. There was no land, no sky, nothing but a screaming, vertical river of white. The house, built of thick, true logs, shuddered. The shutters, heavy wooden things, banged and vibrated against their latches. Calder jammed wooden chocks under the main door, and Lydia stuffed the straw Rosie had twisted into every crack, every seam, her fingers quick and deft. They ate standing, a cold supper of bread and cheese, too tense to sit. The wind was a living thing, a predator clawing at the chinking, searching for a way in. "We have to watch the fire," Calder said, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's roar. "If it goes out, we freeze. If a spark gets loose, we burn. We'll take shifts." "I'll take the first," Lydia said. "No, I will. You sleep, with the children." He pointed to the loft, but Lydia shook her head. "They'll be colder up there, and afraid." She pulled the truckle bed from its corner, dragging it close to the hearth, into the small circle of radiant warmth. She and Calder moved the children, already asleep in their clothes, and nested them onto the small bed, piling every blanket they owned on top of them. The children slept, oblivious to the war outside, their face flushed with warmth. The clock on the mantel ticked. 9 o'clock, 10. The wind only grew louder, a sound of such immense, empty rage that it seemed impossible the small house could stand. Calder sat on the low hearthstones, feeding the fire log by log, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him. He was not just watching the fire, he was watching the door. The cut harness lay nearby. He knew, and Lydia knew, that this storm was a temporary shield. It held Brand at bay, but it also trapped them. Lydia did not go to the loft. She sat on the small stool on the other side of the hearth, her knees drawn up, mending the harness. Her hands, he noticed, were steady. She was stitching the thick 2-inch leather with a heavy awl and waxed thread from his own workbench. It was slow, brutal work for a woman's hands, but she did not falter. Midnight. The house was an island in a roaring white ocean. Calder stood, stretching his back, the muscles tight. He looked at his hands. In the hurried, desperate work of the afternoon, he had split the skin on 3 knuckles. They were red, raw, and swollen in the cold, weeping small beads of blood. He turned to the basin to wash them, and Lydia stood up. "Sit," she said. It was not a request. He paused, surprised by the quiet authority in her voice. He sat back down on the hearth. She went to the dry sink, poured a small amount of their precious water into a tin cup, and set it near the fire to warm. From her own small carpet bag, one of the few things Brand hadn't stolen, she took a roll of clean, white linen. She came back and knelt in front of him. "Give me your hands," she said. He hesitated. His hands were his life, but they were tools. They were stained, calloused, scarred. He had not thought of them as something deserving of care. He slowly extended them, palms down. Lydia took his left hand in hers. Her fingers were cold, but her touch was firm. She dipped a scrap of the linen into the warm water and began, with a tenderness that was almost painful, to clean the cuts. He flinched, not at the sting, but at the contact. It had been 2 years since a woman had touched him with such purpose, such gentleness. She worked in silence, her head bent, the firelight catching the chestnut highlights in her hair. Her breath and his made small, white clouds in the space between them. The only sounds were the roar of the wind, the crackle of the logs, and the small, wet sound of the cloth on his skin. She cleaned each cut, her touch meticulous, respectful. Then she tore the linen into strips and, with a practiced tightness, she bound his knuckles. When she was finished, she did not let go. She held his large, rough, bandaged hand in her 2 smaller, finer ones. She looked at it, then up at him. The firelight was reflected in her eyes, 2 small, dancing flames, in this small, warm bubble, surrounded by the blizzard. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. It was a language they were both beginning to understand. You have good hands, she whispered, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear it. They are strong. He looked at their joined hands. They're just hands. No, she said, her thumb gently brushing his wrist. They're a smith's hands. They build things. They mend what's broken. She looked at the harness, mended by her side. Like you. He felt a tightness in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He cleared his throat. You should have been a doctor, not a bride. A shadow crossed her face. She let go of his hand and returned to her stool, folding her own hands in her lap. My father was in Elm Ravine, back in Ohio. I was his assistant, I suppose. I read his medical books. He said I had the touch for it. Elm Ravine, Calder repeated, the name sounding strange and soft in the rough-hewn room. Sounds green. She smiled, a small, sad smile. It was all apple orchards and quiet streets. It smelled like baked apples and old paper from my father's library. It was a safe place. Her smile faded. Safe places don't last. The fever came. It took him. And my mother. I was left with just the books. He watched her, seeing the girl she had been, the one who smelled apples and read books. And he saw the woman she had become, the one who knelt in mud and fought for her life. You read to the children, he said. It was not a question. They're sounding out words I've never heard of. Milo he is so smart, she said, her face lighting. He's hungry for it. Rosie just likes the pictures I draw. She likes the stories. May, my wife, he said, the name feeling thick on his tongue. She liked stories. She liked the rain. She said it was the sky's music. When we'd get a summer storm, she'd drag me outside. She'd dance, right in the mud. Dance circles around the soup pot when it was on the fire. He smiled, a rough, pained expression. I told her she was a fool. She'd catch her death. She said she'd rather die dancing than live sitting still. He hadn't spoken of May like this, not to anyone. He hadn't known he still could. He looked at Lydia, and she was not looking at him with pity. She was looking at him with understanding. She reached out, her hand hesitant, and laid it on his arm, just above the elbow. Her touch was light, but it anchored him. His hand, the one she had bandaged, found hers. He did not take it. He simply covered it, his rough, warm skin against hers. A moment of stillness. Then, his fingers, slowly, cautiously, laced with hers. They sat like that for a long time. The wind howled. The fire crackled. Their hands were joined. He felt her lean. It was a slow, tentative movement, a question. He did not move, did not tense. He was a wall, and she was trusting him to hold. Her shoulder touched his. Then, with a small sigh, a sound of profound, bone-deep weariness, she laid her head on his chest. He could feel the warmth of her hair through his wool shirt. He could feel her breathing. He held his own breath, his heart suddenly loud in his ears. She must be able to hear it. He could hear his own blood, a heavy, rushing sound. Then it settled, and he felt her head move as his heart found its rhythm, the steady, solid beat of his forge hammer. Thump, 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 thump. A rhythm of work, of life, of endurance. She was so light. He felt an overwhelming, fierce urge to protect her, an urge that was different from the one he felt for his children. It was not just duty. He slowly, very slowly, raised his free arm and put it around her shoulders, drawing her in, just slightly, from the cold. She did not resist. She melted against him. He looked down at the top of her head, at the chestnut hair, and felt the storm inside him, the one that had been raging since May died, finally begin to quiet. He shifted his chin, and she looked up. Her face was inches from his. Her eyes were dark, her lips slightly parted. She was not afraid. He lowered his head. It was the slowest movement of his life. He was giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. His lips touched hers. It was not a kiss of passion or of hunger. It was a kiss of profound, desperate comfort. It was as light as the ash that settled on the hearth. It was warm. It was chaste. It was the taste of wood smoke and salt and the smallest, lingering hint of hope. It lasted no longer than a breath, a recognition. It lingered, warm as the fire, and stopped exactly where his heart urged him forward. But his conscience and his respect for her held the line. He pulled back, just an inch. He looked into her eyes. "No hurry," he whispered, his voice thick. "Out here, things that last, they're forged slow. They have to be, to stand the cold." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. They did not fall. They just hung there, glittering in the firelight, making her eyes brighter. She smiled, a small, trembling, beautiful smile. They sat for another hour. The storm raged. The children slept. Eventually, the tension of the day, the week, claimed them. They didn't move to the beds. They leaned back against the warm stones of the hearth, his arms still around her, her head on his shoulder. He pulled his heavy canvas coat from its peg and draped it over them both. A shared blanket. His hand, the unbandaged one, found her hair, and he gently, almost unconsciously, stroked a damp tendril back from her temple. It was a simple, decent, and deeply intimate act. It was not a claim. It was shelter. They dozed, not sleeping, in the warm cocoon of the fire, the coat, and each other. Sometime in the deepest, darkest part of the night, a small voice cut through the sound of the wind. It was from the truckle bed. "Mama!" It was Rosie, her voice thick with sleep, a question born from a dream. Lydia's whole body went rigid. Her head came up from his chest. She looked at Calder, her eyes wide with panic and a kind of terrible, aching sorrow. It was the wrong name. She was the wrong woman. Calder looked at her. He saw the pain in her face. He saw her about to say, "I'm not her." He saw the child, dreaming, seeking comfort in the storm. He gave a single, slow nod. He was giving her permission. He was telling her it was all right. Lydia turned her head toward the truckle bed. Her voice, when it came, was a soft, clear whisper, a sound of pure, warm shelter. "Mama's here." The blizzard broke as if a hand had swept the sky clean. The morning of the second day dawned quiet, the world buried in a white, profound silence. The sky a painful, brilliant blue. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Inside the cabin, the peace was a fragile skin stretched over the raw tension. The deadline was a day away. Romley would return. They were clearing the sparse breakfast when Milo, posted at the window, spoke, his voice tight. "Pa, they're coming. 3 of them." Calder was at the door in an instant, his rifle in hand. Lydia moved behind him, her eyes on the track, but the figures struggling through the deep. New fallen snow were not the marshals. It was Sister Althea on a borrowed mule, looking small and frail. Beside her was Toby Quince, his face raw from the wind, and with them, a third woman, broad-shouldered and stern, riding astride a heavy draft horse. "It's Althea," Calder said, lowering the rifle. He opened the door. They spilled into the room, bringing a cloud of frozen air. The third woman, Calder now recognized, was Agnes Bell, the widow who ran the town's boarding house. She was a woman of 60 years who looked as if she had been carved from the same granite as the mountains. "We came as soon as the pass was clear," Sister Althea said, her voice a dry rasp. She went straight to the fire, her hands held out to the weak flames. "Toby here. He found me yesterday, before the worst of it. He has news." "The wire came back," Toby Quince said, his voice cracking. He was barely a man, but his eyes held a man's gravity. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. It came from Cheyenne, from the Federal Marshal's office. But Agnes Bell spoke first, her gaze locking on Lydia. She stomped the snow from her boots. "I heard what they did to you, girl. I heard about the wedding." She snorted, a sound like gravel turning. "I run the hotel. I see who comes. I see who goes. And I see who pays. Silas Brand rented my front parlor that night, told me it was for a private business meeting. She unstrapped a heavy, leather-bound book from her saddle. This is my house ledger. I write down everyone who takes a room, or a drink, or a meal. The law says I have to. She placed it on the table and opened it, her thick finger running down a page. Brand paid in cash. He had 2 guests. One was his foreman, Voss, the other. She tapped the line. Signed his name Reeves. He was supposed to be the preacher. Reeves, Lydia whispered, her hand to her throat. That was his name. I recognized him, Agnes said, her voice flat and cold. I don't forget a face. Mr. Holt, that man was no preacher. He was a jailer. Used to work the county prison at Red Hollow, before it burned 10 years ago. He was known for 2 things, a mean streak and a hand that was always out for a bribe. He was wearing a cheap suit that didn't fit, and he smelled like he'd bathed in bad whiskey. He was a fraud, plain and simple. She slammed the book shut. And his signature is in my book. It was the first solid piece, a truth that could be held. And this, Toby Quince said, his voice trembling with the importance of his information. He handed the telegram to Calder, the answer from Cheyenne. Lydia moved to Calder's side, her shoulder pressing against his as they both read the short, terse message. Re-writ 449 Tillman. Writ of protection is invalid if Bride Marlowe protests publicly. Requires testimony of bride and credible witnesses to duress or fraud. Federal law supersedes territorial ordinance. Re-intercepted U.S. mail. Stand by. USM Deputy Clay. What does it mean? Lydia's voice was barely a breath. It means, Calder said, a slow, cold anger beginning to burn in his gut, that Tillman's paper is only as good as the silence he buys. It means the writ is worthless, if you speak, and if you have witnesses. If, Sister Althea repeated, the word sharp. That is a great if. Calder, tomorrow is Sunday, but Monday, that chapel becomes Judge Tillman's courthouse. He is the law and Prospector's rest. He will not let her speak. Land, Calder said, his voice distant. He looked at Agnes, then at Althea. This was never just about Lydia. It's about my land. Romley claims there's a marker error, that my boundary is wrong. He turned, not to his rifle, but to the large, battered wooden chest at the foot of his bed. It had been his father's. He lifted the heavy lid. The smell of old tobacco, oiled leather, and pine rose from it. He felt under a stack of his father's woolen shirts, and his fingers found the edge of a false bottom. He lifted it. Beneath, wrapped in oilskin, was a rolled tube. He spread it on the table, pushing aside Agnes's ledger. It was a map, hand-drawn in faded brown ink, the paper brittle. It was the original survey of Holt's Bend, signed by a territorial surveyor in 1868. This is my father's patent, Calder said, his rough finger tracing a faded line. Here's the creek. Here's the bend. His finger stopped at a small, inked X near the water's edge, far south of where Romley claimed the line was. And here, T as M, 3-sided marker. It's a granite stone, big as a wagon wheel, carved by the surveyors. It marks the true boundary. Romley and Brand are saying the line is here, he pointed, at the narrow part of the creek. But the stone is 20 acres south, 20 acres of the flat, clear land the railroad wants. Have you seen this stone? Sister Althea asked. I've seen it 1,000 times, Calder said, his voice rough. It's where I fish. It's where May liked to sit and read. Then they are not just liars, Agnes Bell said, her voice hard as the granite itself. They are thieves. We have one day, Calder said. Romley returns tomorrow. We won't be here. He looked at the faces of his small, strange army. Tomorrow is Sunday. Sister Althea's eyes, old and tired, suddenly lit with a cold fire. The chapel. Everyone will be at the Cedar Light Chapel for Sunday service. Brand will be there, Calder said, his voice flat, his mind seeing the plan clearly. Tillman will be there. Romley will be at the door. They will be there to look pious, to present themselves as the town's fathers. He looked at Lydia. It's the only place they can't stop you from speaking, not without showing their true, ugly hand to the entire town. He laid it out, his words like hammer blows, forging a weapon from their disparate truths. It has to be done after the opening hymn, but before the sermon, when the room is full and quiet. He turned to Lydia. You will stand. You will make your protest, just as the telegram says. You will tell them what Brand did. You will name Reeves as a fraud. They'll shout me down, she whispered, her hands twisting. They'll call me a liar, a harlot. Then I will speak, Agnes Bell said, placing her hand on her ledger. I will show the signature of the jailer, Reeves. I will testify that I saw him take Brand's money. There is not a man in that room who doesn't know I keep an honest book. And I, Toby Quince said, his voice stronger now, finding his courage. I will testify that I sent the message to Cheyenne and that I received this reply, that the federal marshal's office is watching this town, and this judge. And I, Sister Althea added, her small frame rigid, will testify that Miss Marlowe is not a vagrant, that she is employed by me, as a teacher to the children and as an aide at the infirmary, that she has an honest livelihood, and that she is a woman of character and letters. The plan hung in the air. It was 4 voices against an entire power structure. It was desperate. It was all they had. The map, Calder said, his gaze shifting. They will deny it. Tillman will declare it a forgery from the bench. He looked over at Milo, who had been standing by the chimney, a silent shadow, absorbing every word. Milo, you know the woods. You know the back paths, the ones that avoid the main road. Yes, sir, Milo said. Stepping forward, Calder took a clean piece of Lydia's writing paper. For half an hour, with the meticulous care of a smith measuring a fitting, he copied the boundary lines from his father's map. He marked the creek, the house, and the T.M. There is a man, Calder said, folding the paper. His name is Whit Carden. He's an independent surveyor, camped south of town by the Dry Fork, working the Double Bar K ranch. He's an honest man. He won't be at the chapel. I need you to take this to him, now, before the light changes. He put his hands on his son's small shoulders. Tell him Calder Holt asks him to verify the 3-sided marker at Pine Jaw Creek. Tell him it's a matter of law. And Milo, do not be seen. Milo's face was pale, but his eyes were his father's. He took the folded paper, tucked it deep inside his shirt, and with a last look at Lydia, he slipped out the door like a fox into the snow, with Milo gone. The cabin felt too quiet, the fear too loud. Rosie, sensing the terror that vibrated in the adults, came to Lydia's side and clutched her dress. Are the bad men coming back? Lydia looked at the terror in the child's eyes and knew she could not let it fester. She knelt, forcing a smile. No, sweet. We are getting ready for Sunday. She took the last of their flour, the sack Calder had bought. We are going to make bread, she announced to the room, her voice shaking only slightly. We will need our strength tomorrow. The fear did not leave, but it was channeled. It was given work. Rosie, standing on a stool, helped knead the dough, her small hands covered in flour. Lydia shaped the loaves, her movements quick and sure. Agnes and Althea sat by the fire, talking in low, urgent whispers. The act of making food, the simple, domestic work, pushed back the panic. When the small, dense loaves were baked, Lydia had an idea. From her bag, she pulled the small scrap of blue-gray silk ribbon she had torn from the hem of her ruined wedding dress. With Rosie's help, she tied a small blue ribbon around each loaf. It was a useless, beautiful gesture. It turned an act of survival into an act of hope. It was a promise, a small flag of defiance. As the sun began to set, casting long blue shadows on the snow, Calder went to the forge. The others were inside, resting, gathering their strength. He fired the coals. The whoosh of the bellows was a deep, angry breath in the twilight. He did not take his rifle. He took his hammer. It was his heavy forging hammer, the one he used for the hardest work. The hickory handle was dark with his own sweat, worn smooth, shaped perfectly to his grip. The double-faced head was scarred and polished from a lifetime of striking hot iron. He did not sharpen it. He began to repair it. He checked the wedges that held the head, tapping them tighter. He took a piece of sanded leather and oiled the handle, working the oil in with his bare hands. He was not preparing for a fight. He was not preparing to kill. He was preparing for work. This hammer was his proof. It was his signature. It had built this homestead. It had fed his children. It had mended the town's broken plows and wheels. Tomorrow, he would take it. He would not swing it at a man. He would swing it to drive a stake, to mark the land that was his. It was a symbol, heavy and true as iron. This land, he thought, belongs to the one who works it. Later, the house was dark. The children slept. Calder sat by the cold forge, the hammer resting across his knees, watching the stars, clear as diamonds in the frozen sky, in the cabin, by the light of a single candle. Lydia sat at the table. She took her last piece of clean paper and a pen. She thought of all the things she would say, the accusations, the legal terms, the anger. But she wrote only one sentence. She wrote it for herself, not for the town, not for the judge. She wrote it to remind herself of who she was when she stood up. She read it once, her lips moving silently. I belong to my work, my word, and those who keep theirs. She folded the paper, small and tight, and tucked it deep into the pocket of her dress. It was an anchor. It was armor. She blew out the candle and waited for the dawn. The Cedar Light Chapel was not built for warmth. It was built for endurance. Its pews were hard, its windows tall and thin, and it smelled of damp wool, old varnish, and the kind of fear that only a Sunday sermon could provide. On this morning, it was full. Every family that was not sick, snowed in, or dead was present. They were packed shoulder to shoulder. A captive audience for the week's only drama. The power of Prospector's Rest was seated at the front. Silas Brand sat in the first pew, his tailored black coat looking sinfully rich, his face composed in a mask of pious contemplation. He was the wronged husband, the victim. Beside him sat Aphra Harridan, looking for all the world like a good, solid citizen. Judge Tillman, a heavy man with a face like damp dough, sat near the pulpit, his heavy walking stick resting between his knees, and at the back, by the single door, blocking the only exit, stood Marshal Deke Romley. His arms were crossed. He was not a guest. He was a guard. Calder, Lydia, and the children sat in the last row, an island of pariahs. With them, a silent, grim-faced line, were Sister Althea, Agnes Bell, and Toby Quince. The townspeople gave them a wide berth, as if their troubles were contagious. Calder's heavy forge hammer, its handle wrapped in a scrap of canvas, rested on the floor between his feet. He was still, his face unreadable, his gaze fixed on the back of Silas Brand's head. Reverend Davies, a nervous young man from Boston, cleared his throat. He opened the big leather-bound Bible on the pulpit. Let us begin this Sabbath by opening God's book to the book of Proverbs, chapter 21. To do justice and judgment is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. He glanced nervously at Judge Tillman, who was not smiling. The air in the room was thick, cold, and explosive. Before the Reverend could speak another word, Lydia Marlowe stood up. The sound was not loud, just the scrape of a boot on the rough floorboards, the rustle of a calico dress. But in the charged silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. Every head in the chapel swiveled. Lydia's hands were clasped in front of her. She was pale, but her spine was as straight as the hammer handle at Calder's feet. She looked not at Brand, not at the judge, but at the congregation, at the sea of faces that had judged her in the street. Her voice, when it came, was not the thin whisper of a victim. It was clear, cold, and carried to the rafters. I object. Reverend Davies froze, his mouth open. Judge Tillman's head came up, his face flushing dark red. I object to the writ of protection that has been pinned to Mr. Holt's door Lydia said, her voice gaining strength. The wedding it speaks of was a lie. It was a sham, performed by a false preacher, for the purpose of fraud. I declare this before God, and before this congregation. A great, collective gasp sucked the air from the room. It was a scandal. It was theater. It was wonderful. Silas Brand let out a short, ugly laugh. The woman is hysterical. She's a liar. Blasphemy, Judge Tillman roared, slamming his heavy cane on the floor. This is a house of God. You will be silent. Woman Marshal, remove her. Romley tensed at the door, but before he could take a step, Agnes Bell moved into the aisle. Her voice was a parade ground bellow that drowned out the judge. This is also a house of record. Judge, she boomed, and she held up her thick, leather-bound hotel ledger. And I have brought my book. I saw the so-called preacher. He signed my ledger. The name was Reeves, and he was no minister. He was a jailer from Red Hollow. And I saw him take a pouch of coin from Mr. Brand's hand not 10 minutes after the ceremony. She flipped the book open, the sound echoing. And I'll swear to it on this book, which has seen more truth than that Bible. A wave of murmurs swept the room. A jailer. Agnes Bell don't lie. This is slander hearsay, Tillman bellowed, his face sweating despite the cold. Is this hearsay? Judge, a new, reedy voice shouted. Toby Quince, pale as a ghost but vibrating with purpose, was standing on the pew. I am the territorial telegraph operator, and I have a message from the U.S. Federal Marshal in Cheyenne. He read the telegram, his voice cracking but clear, the words dropping like stones into the silence. Invalid if bride protests, credible witnesses. Federal law supersedes. The word federal changed everything. This was no longer a small-town squabble. And I, Sister Althea's dry, sharp voice cut through, am a credible witness. This woman is not a vagrant. She is under my employ. She tends the sick. She teaches the children. She held up Milo's slate, which she had brought, with the word courage still visible. A woman who teaches this is not the woman you say she is. Ephra Harridan. The room was in chaos. People were standing, turning, arguing. This is madness, Harridan shrieked from the front pew. She's a witch. She's charmed them. Through the noise, Calder Holt stood up. He picked up his hammer. He picked up the map, and he began to walk. He walked up the center aisle, past the shocked faces of his neighbors. They parted for him, for the silent blacksmith and the heavy hammer he carried. He did not look at Brand. He did not look at Tillman. He walked to the pulpit, past the stunned Reverend Davies, and he placed his items on the open Bible. He did not say a word. The thud of the hammer on the book was a final, damning gavel. He unrolled the map. Its old, brittle paper covering the book of Proverbs. What is this? Tillman sputtered, rising. What is the meaning of this tool? That, a new voice said from the back, is a boundary map. The main door, left unguarded by Romley, had opened. Whit Carden, the surveyor, stood there, his hat in his hands. He was windburned, and his boots were caked in snow. He walked up the aisle, his eyes on the map, not on the judge. I was asked to check a marker, Carden said to the room. He pointed to the map. That one, the three-sided marker at Pine Jaw Bend. I found it, not 30 minutes ago. It's granite. It's original, and it's exactly where this map says it is. It's 20 acres south of where the new railroad claim stakes are. He looked directly at Judge Tillman. Someone, Judge, has been moving stakes, and that is a federal crime. This was it, the breaking point. The crowd was a snarling beast, turning on its masters. Tillman was white, his jowls trembling. Harridan looked sick. Romley was trapped, his hand on his gun, his authority bleeding away with every second. Silas Brand, seeing his plan, his land, his prize, all turning to ash, snapped. He turned to his foreman, a rough man named Voss, in the pew behind him. Do something, Voss. A man who only understood one kind of authority, did the only thing he knew. He stood up, pulled a heavy Colt revolver from under his coat. and pointed it at the pulpit. "This is all a setup," he screamed, his eyes wild. "You're all liars, blasphemers." The chapel screamed. People dove for the floor. Sister Althea crossed herself, and from the small, unused choir loft above, a sound pierced the panic, a high, thin, piercing whet. It was a tin whistle. Milo, hidden in the shadows as planned, had blown his signal. It was not loud, but it was different. It cut through Voss's rage, through the screams. The gunman flinched, his head instinctively snapping up toward the strange noise. It was the only opening Deke Romley needed. He had been a marshal for 20 years. He was a hard man, maybe a corrupt one, but he was not a coward. And no man, no matter who paid him, was going to draw a gun in a full chapel on his watch. It was a personal, professional insult. In the second, Voss was distracted. Romley moved. He was not a big man. He was a fast one. 3 steps, a brutal chop to Voss's wrist, and the gun clattered, spinning, onto the floor. Romley had the man's arm twisted behind his back, his knee in his spine, before the whistle's echo had died. "No guns in church," Romley growled, loud enough for the whole room to hear. He was saving his own hide, his own authority. He was the law, and he was proving it. There was a half-second of total silence. Then, in the back, Agnes Bell, her face a mask of triumph, began to clap. It was a slow, heavy, deliberate sound. Clap, clap, clap. Sister Althea joined her. Then Toby. Then Whit Carden. Then a rancher in the 3rd row. Then his wife. Then the entire congregation. It was not a polite applause. It was a rising, rhythmic, powerful noise. The sound of 40 anvils striking in unison. A sound of judgment. A verdict rendered by the people. Judge Tillman, his face ashen, his hands shaking, saw his power, his authority, and his railroad deal evaporate. He slammed his cane on the floor, over and over, his voice a reedy screech. "Order, order, 1. I will have order." He looked at the map. He looked at the hammer. He looked at the furious, righteous faces of the town. In light of this testimony, he stammered. And the pending federal inquiry, the writ of protection, number 449, is hereby suspended, pending further review. It was over. He had broken. Brand did not speak. His face was a mask of cold, white fury. He watched Calder put his hammer back in its canvas sling. He watched Lydia, her face full of tears and a terrible, beautiful relief, take her children's hands. The crowd began to filter out, buzzing, alive, energized by the victory. They were patting Calder on the back, shaking Whit Carden's hand. Brand pushed his way through the crowd, his face murderous. He stopped, inches from Marshal Romley, who was cuffing his foreman. Brand leaned in, his voice a low, venomous hiss, meant only for the marshal. "Tonight, there will be no witnesses. We take what is ours, by force." He turned and strode out of the chapel, but he had not been quiet enough. He had not seen the small, 6-year-old girl, half hidden behind Lydia's skirt, her wide, dark eyes watching his face. Rosie had not understood the words, but she had seen the lips move. She had seen the hatred in his eyes, and she had heard the sound. She knew the sound of a bad man. She pulled on Lydia's hand, her small face suddenly afraid. The ride back from the chapel was a funeral procession with a living corpse. They had won the battle, but Rosie's small, terrified voice in the wagon confirmed the war. "He was so mad. Pa," she whispered from her place between Calder and Lydia, her small hand clutching Lydia's sleeve. The man in the black coat, his eyes were like the forge when the air is wrong, all fire and smoke. Lydia's arm tightened around the child. "We saw it too, sweet." Calder said nothing. He drove the wagon, his eyes on the snowy track, his mind calculating. Brand's words to Romley, "Tonight by force," were a death sentence. The law, in the form of Judge Tillman, had failed Brand. Now Brand would become his own law. Sister Althea, Agnes Bell, and Toby Quince rode behind them. They did not go to their own homes in town. They followed the wagon up the track to Holt's Bend. There was no discussion. The chapel had not been a victory. It had been an indictment, and the accused were now the jury and the executioners. They reached the homestead as the sun began to bleed its last red light over the western peaks. The blue of the snow was absolute, the cold profound. "They'll come after full dark," Calder said, his voice flat as he unhitched Clara. "They'll wait until the moon is high enough to see by, but not bright enough to be seen." No one wasted time. This was not a panic. It was a preparation, grim and methodical. "Agnes, Toby, the livestock," Calder commanded. "All of them in the main stable. Bar the door, not the small pen." "Milo," he said, and his son was instantly at his side. "You're not in the house tonight. You're in the stable, in the hayloft. You'll be warm. You'll be safe. But you have a job." "The goats?" Milo asked, his voice low, his eyes wide but steady. "The goats," Calder confirmed. "You'll wait for the signal. You'll know it when you hear it. And you do not, under any circumstances, come out until I come for you. Understand?" "Yes, sir." Milo vanished toward the stable. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick. The children were not children. They were part of a crew. Rosie, sensing the gravity, silently helped Sister Althea stack the firewood by the door. "The lamps," Lydia said, her voice quiet. "We let them burn as normal. Then we put them out at the normal time. It must look like we are sleeping, like we are. Fools. Like we believe we're safe," Calder agreed, his voice rough. He went to the cold hearth. The fire had been out since morning. "The papers." Lydia retrieved the small, precious bundle, his father's map. The Cheyenne telegram. Agnes's sworn statement. Calder pried up the heavy iron top of the cook stove, his fingers sure. He placed the oilskin-wrapped bundle deep inside the cold oven chamber. He lowered the heavy iron, the clang echoing softly in the room. "If they burn the house," Althea said, her voice a dry rasp, "they'll find it." "If they burn the house," Calder said, his voice cold, "it won't matter." "Toby," Agnes called from the porch. "Bring that wire." Toby Quince, the telegraph operator, was in his element. He had Calder's spool of thin, strong wire used for mending fences. He and Agnes worked in the deepening twilight, a strange, grim pair. They strung the wire low, ankle high, in a wide perimeter around the cabin, just at the edge of the clearing, looping it from the woodpile to the forge to the well. And on it, Toby tied bells. Not real bells, but the tools of a homesteader's life. 2 tin cups with pebbles inside, a broken spur that would jingle, the small, high-pitched bell from Rosie's old cat, salvaged from a trunk. They finished as the last light died. The homestead was plunged into a deep, cold dark. Inside, Lydia blew out the main lamp, one by one. The lights went out. Holt's Bend was asleep, but it was not. Calder stood in the blackness by the front window, his father's rifle a cold, heavy weight in his hands. Lydia was near the door, her back to the wall. In her hands, she held Agnes Bell's snub-nosed pistol, a heavy, solid thing. Agnes had pressed it into her hand. "It's a snake gun, a child, short, ugly, and it does its work. Point and pull. Don't think." Sister Althea sat in a rocking chair near the cold hearth, invisible in the dark. Beside her, a heavy bucket. It was not water. It was the lie-heavy, caustic sludge from the bottom of the ash barrel. Agnes and Toby were at the back, by the small window that overlooked the creek, armed with a shotgun and an old cavalry saber. They waited. The moon, a cold, thin sliver, rose, casting skeletal shadows from the pine trees. The silence was absolute. There was no wind. The only sound was the blood pounding in their ears. An hour passed, then another. Tink. The sound was tiny, almost imaginary. Calder's body went rigid. Lydia's breath hitched. Tink, tinkle, clang. The tin cup, the alarm wire. "They're here," Calder whispered. "Front." Lydia moved, a shadow against the door. Through the window. Calder saw them. Not on horses, on foot, moving from the trees. Dark shapes on the white snow. 1, 2, 3, 5. Brand, Voss, and 3 others. They had left their horses tied back, to be quiet. The bells, which had signaled their arrival, had also spooked their horses. In the distance, a horse screamed. A high, panicked sound. "Damn it," a low voice. "Voss's. Cursed. Forget the horses to the house." The bells were Milo's signal. In the dark, warm stable, he heard the faint jingle. He heard the panicked horses. He crawled to the gate of the small, secondary pen. He took a deep breath, and with all his strength, he pulled the heavy wooden bar. He slapped the lead goat, a mean-tempered billy. Go-go! The flock of a dozen goats, already spooked by the noise and the strange men, exploded from the pen. They did not run from the attackers. They ran past them, a wave of bleeding, white and gray panic, charging straight for the line of tethered horses. The effect was instantaneous. The horses, already nervous, broke. Reins snapped. They reared, screamed, and scattered. A thundering of hooves vanishing into the dark, pursued by a flock of frantic goats. "The horses, you fools! Get the horses!" Brand roared, his plan falling apart. 2 of his men broke and ran after the animals. But Brand, Voss, and 1 other did not. They were here for blood. They ran for the house. Voss had a can in his hand, kerosene. Brand had his pistol. "Now, Lydia," Calder said, his voice calm. Lydia pulled the heavy bar from the door, opened it just a crack, and stepped out onto the dark porch. She was a silhouette against the dark cabin. Brand saw her. He raised his pistol, a black shape against the snow. "Wife, I've come for you." Lydia raised Agnes's pistol with both hands, her arms shaking. She did not aim at Brand. She aimed at the sky. She squeezed the trigger. The crack of the small, powerful gun was a physical blow. It ripped the silence to shreds. A flat, ugly sound that echoed off the mountains. "Get back!" she screamed, her voice a raw, terrified shriek of defiance. The gunshot, a signal to the world, was also a signal to the man who had been waiting, watching, from the tree line. A single rider spurred his horse into the clearing. Marshal Deke Romley. He had followed them. He had been caught, hesitant, between his paycheck and his badge. The gunshot, the woman's scream, the memory of the chapel, the cheers of the town, the federal telegram, it all converged. He was the law, and this was chaos. He drew his rifle. "Brand, stand down." Brand didn't even look at him. He was mad with rage. He saw Lydia on the porch, a prize. He saw the door. He lunged, ignoring the marshal, ignoring everything but his target. He charged the steps. He hit the porch just as Calder filled the doorway. Calder was not holding his rifle. He was holding his hammer. Brand raised his pistol to fire point blank. Calder didn't swing. He shoved. He used the hammer like a battering ram. The heavy, polished hickory handle striking not the man, but the gun. A brutal, upward block. The clack of wood on metal was sharp, clean. The pistol flew from Brand's grasp, spinning into a snowdrift, its one shot firing harmlessly into the porch roof. Before Brand could recover, Calder slammed the heavy oak door in his face. The boom was final. The heavy bar dropped into its iron brackets. Brand, disarmed, bellowed in rage and pounded on the door. At the side of the house, Voss was at his own work. He had lost his kerosene, but he had a torch. He'd grabbed a bundle of the straw used for chinking. He struck a match, the flare illuminating his twisted, angry face. "Burn, then!" he snarled, shoving the new small fire against the dry log wall. The flame licked up, catching the dry wood. A shadow detached itself from the wall. Sister Althea. She had been waiting. She rose from the woodpile like a small, dark angel of wrath. "Coward!" she shrieked, her voice a fury that matched the fire. She heaved the heavy bucket of lye sludge. It was not a clean splash. It was a splat. The thick, gray, caustic muck hit the wall. extinguishing the fire in a cloud of hissing, foul-smelling steam. It smothered the flames, and it smothered Voss, drenching his face and chest. He screamed, a high, thin sound, as the lie bit into his eyes. He dropped the torch, clawing at his face, blind and ruined. The yard was a scene from a fever dream. Men running, horses gone, one man blind and screaming, the leader pounding on a door he could not break. Marshal Deke Romley had seen enough. He had made his choice. His authority had been shattered in the chapel, but his badge was still pinned to his chest. He spurred his horse into the center of the yard, his rifle level. "Enough," he roared, his voice the voice of the law, finally and absolutely. "Drop your weapons. It is over." He pointed his rifle at the last man, the one who was standing, confused, between the screaming Voss and the pounding Brand. "Hands up now." The man, a hired hand, dropped his gun and raised his hands. Romley swung his rifle to Brand, who had frozen on the porch. "Brand, you are under arrest for armed assault, for attempted arson, for resisting an officer of the law." He was shouting, but he was not shouting at Brand. He was shouting for the witnesses inside the house. He was building his case, saving his own skin. The bar on the door lifted. The door opened, slow and heavy. Calder Holt stepped out. His hammer was still in his hand, resting on his shoulder. He was not breathing hard. He was just watching. Lydia came out behind him. The small, smoking pistol was still in her hand, but it was pointed at the ground. She was shaking, a fine, violent tremor that ran through her whole body. But she was standing. The yard was filled with smoke and steam and the sharp, coppery smell of gunpowder. In the sudden, terrible silence, Calder turned. He found Lydia's free hand. He took it. His grip was an anchor, a solid, ironclad promise. Lydia looked at him. Her lips were trembling. She could not speak, but her eyes, fixed on his, were perfectly, utterly calm. She squeezed his hand, and she gave a single, sharp nod. They were alive. The fight was over. The aftermath of the battle was a new kind of silence. Marshal Romley, his face a mask of grim duty, had taken Brand and his men. Voss, blinded and screaming, was tied to a horse, a grim trophy of his own failed malice. Agnes, Althea, and Toby had stayed until the last of the men were gone, their horses vanishing over the ridge. They had offered to stay the night, but Calder had shaken his head. The fight was over. The siege was broken. The long, dark hours before dawn were spent in a state of mutual shock. Calder had retrieved Milo from the hayloft, clasping the boy's head to his chest in a rare, violent embrace, his own body trembling. He had checked the house, the stable, the scorch mark on the wall. He had been a man pacing a cage, his adrenaline still demanding a fight that was already finished. Now, in the hour before true dawn, the cabin was still. A new, gentle snow had begun to fall, a soft, white apology from the sky. It was a mercy snow, already blurring the ugly, trampled tracks in the yard, covering the dark, frozen patches of lye and spilled powder. Inside, the children slept a sleep so deep it was almost a death. Milo, his courage spent, lay limp in the truckle bed, his face pale. Rosie was curled against him, her hand fisted in his shirt, her breathing finally deep and even. Calder and Lydia had not slept. They sat at the long pine table, the quiet of the house a roaring in their ears. The embers in the main hearth were a last, pulsing red, a single, deep star in the cold. Gray room. Calder spoke first, his voice a low, rough gravel, as if he hadn't used it in days. "They'll be taken to Fort Rollins. Romley. He'll have to testify. The federal marshal in Cheyenne will want a full report." He was staring at his own bandaged hands, resting on the table. "We'll have to go, to testify. All of us." Lydia just nodded, her hands wrapped around a cold tin cup. He cleared his throat. "When we're there, at the courthouse, we'll be making sworn statements about the land, about you." He looked up, and his eyes met hers. They were clear, exhausted, but completely present. "We could, while we're there, with the law. We could join the names. On the testimony. Holt and Marlowe, or just Holt, if you wanted. It would be legal. No one could question it. After this, it was the most Calder proposal he could have made. Not of love, but of law, of protection, of merging their names on a legal document to build a higher, stronger wall. Lydia looked at him, at this man, his face gray with exhaustion, the lines around his eyes etched deep with soot and weariness. He was offering her his name, the last, best protection he had. She reached across the table, not to take his hand, but to lay hers beside it. "Calder," she said, her voice quiet, but with a new, certain strength. I have been running for a long time. I ran from Ohio. I was running to a marriage, to a stranger, because I was afraid of being alone. Then I was running from Silas Brand, because I was afraid of being owned." She shook her head, a small, definite motion. I will not carry a name out of fear ever again, not even yours." He flinched. His face, which had been open, shuddered. He looked down at his hands, at the mended leather, at the bandages she had tied. "I see," he said, his voice flat. He thought it was a rejection. "No," she said, and her voice was suddenly fierce. She stood and walked around the table until she was standing in front of him. "No, you don't." He looked up, surprised. "I am not staying here because I am afraid," she said, her voice a low, clear bell. "I am not staying because you saved me. I am not staying because I need your name or your protection. I am staying because for the first time in my life, I am not running. I am here." She placed a hand on the sleeve of his worn shirt. "I am staying because I choose this. I choose this house. I choose the children. I choose you." He stood, slowly, as if pulled by a force he didn't understand. They were in the small, cold space between the table and the dying fire. He was a head taller than her, a solid, broad wall of a man. He looked down at her, at the raw courage in her face, and he finally understood. It was not about safety. It was about choice. "Lydia Marlowe?" he whispered, her name a rough prayer. "You carry your own name. It's a strong one, forged in. Well, it's strong." He took a ragged breath. "But this house, it can carry ours. Both of them." He raised his hand. Not the calloused, strong one, but the one she had mended. His bandaged knuckles, a testament to his own vulnerability, came up and gently, so gently, brushed the hair from her cheek. She was real. She was standing here. She had chosen. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. A single, hot tear, the last one, escaped and hit his bandage. "You are shaking," he whispered. "So are you," she breathed. He did not kiss her. Instead, he lowered his head and rested his forehead against hers. It was a gesture of such profound, quiet intimacy that it made her heart stop. They stood like that, in the center of the cold room, sharing the same air, their breath mingling in a small, white cloud. The world was reduced to this single point of contact, this shared silence, the roar of the battle, the wind, the fear. It all went quiet. His free hand, his good one, moved. It did not go to her waist, not to her back. It moved, slowly, to the center of her chest, splayed flat over her wool dress, over the frantic, pulsing beat of her heart. He was a smith, and this was a life he had helped mend, and he needed to feel its pulse. He held his hand there, solid and warm, anchoring her. It's beating so fast," she whispered, her eyes still closed, embarrassed. "It's steady," he rumbled, his voice a low vibration she felt in her own chest. "It's here." She stayed like that, her world held between his hand on her heart and his forehead against hers. Then she opened her eyes. He was looking at her, his gaze clear and deep, all the shadows gone. He lowered his head. The first kiss, by the fire in the blizzard, had been one of comfort, It had been ash and shelter. This one was intention. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion or of claiming. It was a kiss of arrival. It was warm, and it was slow, and it was real. It was not a kiss of taking, but of asking. Are you here? Are you sure? Her lips, which had been so cold, so pressed thin with fear, softened. She answered. Her own small, chapped hands came up and rested on his arms, not to pull him closer, but simply to hold on. Yes, I am here. When they pulled back, the air in the room was different. It had a new weight, a new warmth. He drew her in, finally, his arms coming around her, and it was not a lover's embrace. Not yet. It was the embrace of a man who had found something he thought was lost. He held her, his chin resting on the top of her head, his hands resting on the small of her back. He was holding her as if she were a piece of fine, irreplaceable glass. And Lydia, who had stood with a spine of iron for so long, finally leaned. She let her head rest on his solid chest, hearing the slow, steady thump-thump of his heart beneath her ear. It was the sound of his forge hammer. It was the sound of home. They stood there for a long time, simply holding each other up. The lie, he murmured into her hair. It ate the chinking, on the north wall. I know, she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt. It needs a good, hard scrub, and a new seal. He chuckled, a low, rusty sound. That window, the one by the table, it's too small. Lets in the afternoon sun, but the creek is to the east. She pulled back, just enough to look up at him. The east. We could make a bigger window, he said, as if the idea was just occurring to him. A wide one, to let the morning light in. For the table. He paused. For Milo's books. He needs a proper desk, not just the floor. Lydia's face, pale and exhausted, lit from within. A desk, a window. This was not a fortress. This was a future. A desk, she said, the word tasting sweet. Yes, and a shelf. For Rosie. She loves to draw. I saw, in the catalog at Harridan's, a small box of colored paints. Paints, Calder said, testing the word. It was a word of such impossible, beautiful luxury. Paints, yes, for Rosie. He led her, not to the bed, but to the small, hard bench by the new, clean window. They sat, side by side, their shoulders touching. He took her hand, lacing his fingers with hers, the bandaged knuckles rough against her skin. They sat in silence, watching the new snow fall. It was a silent vow. No preacher, no judge, just a man and a woman, hand in hand, watching the world be made clean. The gray light in the window turned to a pale, hopeful blue. A rooster, confused by the night's chaos, let out a muffled, hesitant crow from the stable. A new day. Lydia let out a long, slow breath. She was tired, so tired her bones ached, but her mind was clear. She stood up. Calder watched her. She did not go to the cot in the loft. She went to the stove, her stove. She opened the iron lid, retrieved the oilskin packet of papers, and placed them carefully on the mantel, where they belonged. Then she went to the bin, took the sack of flour, the one he had bought, the one she had used to bake their defiant bread, and she carried it to the table. She found her bowl. She began to sift. Calder did not move. He just sat, his hands resting on his knees, and watched her. The first sound of the new day at Holt's Bend was not a gunshot. It was not a scream. It was the soft, rhythmic sound of a woman sifting flour. And soon, the cabin was not filled with the sharp, bitter smell of gunpowder. It was filled with the warm, steady, and promising scent of baking bread. Spring came to the high country not as a gentle request, but as a raw, wet command. It came with the sound of cracking ice on the Pine Jaw Creek and the roar of meltwater. The snows receded, leaving the earth scarred and muddy, but alive. And with the first passable roads, the mail rider from Cheyenne returned. He brought a thick envelope bearing a federal seal. Lydia and Calder stood on the porch, the same porch they had defended, and read it together. It was not a letter. It was a judgment. The writ of protection, number 449, was dismissed, declared null and void, an act of territorial overreach. But it did not end there. The U.S. Marshal's Office, prompted by the evidence of mail interception and land fraud, was opening a formal investigation into the conduct of Judge Tillman, Ephra Harridan, and their irregular dealings with the Frontier Divide Railroad. The power structure that had nearly crushed them had, in its arrogance, collapsed upon itself. A week later, Whit Carden, the surveyor, returned. He was not alone. He was accompanied by a quiet, stern man in a city suit who was a land agent for the territory. They did not ride to the house. They went straight to the creek. Calder, Lydia, and Milo followed. They watched as the two men, using Carden's transit and a Gunter's chain, measured the land. They found the three-sided marker, the granite stone where May had liked to sit. It was exactly where Calder's father's map had claimed. The land agent drove a new, oaken stake deep into the damp earth, its top painted bright red. "This is your line, Mr. Holt," he said, his voice flat. "The patent is clear." Holt's Bend, it turned out, was a full 20 acres larger than the town had been led to believe, encompassing the very flat, clear ground the railroad had coveted. The fallout in Prospector's Rest was swift. Marshal Deke Romley, finding himself caught between a federal investigation and a town that had celebrated his defeat, made a choice. He chose his badge. When the U.S. Marshal arrived from Cheyenne, Romley's testimony was the most damning. He spoke of Brand's conspiracy, of the armed assault, the attempted arson, the intimidation of a citizen. He conveniently and expertly omitted his own initial compliance, painting himself as a man who had been playing along, waiting for the right moment to uphold the true law. He, personally, put the chains on Silas Brand. The town watched as Brand, his handsome face pale and venomous, was loaded onto a prison wagon bound for Fort Rawlins, to await a federal trial he could not buy his way out of. The town, free of its primary shadows, began to heal. Sister Althea, energized by her victory, seized the moment. The Cedar Light Chapel, she declared, would no longer be a place of fear once a week. It would be a place of learning 7 days a week. She opened a night school for the ranchers, the children, and any prospector who wanted to learn to read more than a brand. Lydia, naturally, became the teacher. She stood at the front of the room, her voice clear and steady, no longer a victim, but a leader. In the front pew, Milo labored over his slate, beneath the word courage, which he had mastered. He was now carefully, painfully, sounding out mercy. Rosie, too young for letters, sat on the floor, drawing. She drew a picture of her home, the log cabin by the creek. It was a child's drawing, all smoke and angles, but it was accurate. It had 3 chimneys, the main hearth, the kitchen stove, and the forge. It was a picture of a house where work and warmth and family all lived as one. The community's poison was purged in its own way. Agnes Bell, her ledger having served its purpose, declared it was too full of bad memories to keep. She held a town auction. The ledger, open to the page with the jailer Reeves's signature, was the only item the ranchers and townsfolk, in a fit of good humor and justice, bid against each other until it sold for over $60. Agnes, true to her word, took every dollar and gave it to Lydia, to buy books and paper for the new school. A week after that, the long, creaking wooden sign that read, "Harridan's Supply," was taken down. Harridan, facing a federal inquiry in a town that would no longer buy his salt, had sold his stock for pennies on the dollar and vanished east. The store, under new, honest ownership, reopened as the Prospector's Rest Mercantile. That spring, as the first wild mountain lilies pushed up through the snow, Calder and Lydia were married. There was no white dress, no crowded chapel. They stood on the porch, the one they had defended, under the shade of the tall cypress tree. Sister Althea read the service, her voice a reedy, powerful blessing on the clear air. Milo, wearing his father's old coat, stood as Calder's witness. Rosie, her hair tied with a blue silk ribbon, was the flower girl. She did not, however, carry a basket of petals. She carried a small, carved wooden bowl. When Sister Althea, her voice thick, pronounced them man and wife, Rosie stepped forward. She reached into the bowl and tossed handfuls of fine, gray ash from the hearth, letting it glitter in the sun before settling on the porch floor. Agnes Bell, who had come to stand witness, looked confused. "Child, why ash?" Rosie smiled, a gap-toothed, certain smile, and recited the line she had clearly practiced. "Because flowers die, ash is what's left. Ash keeps the fire safe till morning." Lydia, her eyes streaming, pulled the girl into her arms. As Calder, his own face rough with an emotion he could not name, watched. He took Lydia's hand, the one that now wore a simple band of iron he had forged himself, and he knew it was the truest vow he would ever make. He did not change the name of the homestead, but he added to it. The next week, he fired the forge and, with Milo working the bellows, he created a new sign. He hung it from the gate. He had painted the letters himself, thick and black. Holt Marlowe Forge Farm. And beneath the words, he had forged, in heavy, dark iron, a smith's hammer, its handle intertwined with a single, graceful branch of cypress, the railroad, finding the Pine Jaw Bend suddenly and publicly, contested by federal agents and a very clear land patent, made a business decision. The route was deemed problematic. They rerouted their spur line a full 20 miles south, through the flat, empty, and uncontested Dry Lantern Flats. Prospector's Rest never got its railroad boom. It never became a depot town full of strangers and speculators. It got something better. It got a school. It got an honest mercantile. And it got a forge that rang true every morning. The town survived not on a rumor of gold, or the false promise of a railroad, but on the real things, on the farms that fed it, the forge that armed it, and the school that taught it. The summer was warm, and the nights were filled with the soft, green lights of fireflies. Calder and Lydia sat on the new, wider porch, watching the children, their shapes dark against the twilight, trying to catch the lights in a jar. The new, wide window Calder had built threw a warm, yellow rectangle of light onto the yard. Lydia leaned her head on Calder's shoulder. His arm, solid and sure, was around her. The air was soft, smelling of pine and the river. She thought back to that first day, to the cold, the filth, the abject terror. She remembered the whispers she had repeated, over and over, into the mud. "Please, have mercy." She whispered it again, so softly only he could hear. "Have mercy." Calder's arm tightened. He looked down at her, his love a quiet, steady thing. Lydia smiled, a slow, sure smile. And she corrected herself. She looked at the house, at the children, at the man beside her. "Mercy," she whispered, her voice no longer a plea, but a statement of fact. "Found a home, and in the valley." As the last of the light faded, the sound of the forge was quiet, but the town and the family rested easy, knowing it would ring again in the morning. It was the valley's heartbeat, a steady, reliable sound that reminded everyone that anything worth having, anything that lasts, is forged. It is built from hard work and kept promises, and the kind of love that knows how to respect a boundary, and then builds a home right inside it. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and support us by hitting that hype button. It helps more than you know, and ensures these stories can be heard by many more.